morning class. This is ECON 353 macroeconomics class. Today is February 17th, Thursday. The class will move on to chapter 7 of the textbook, which is unemployment, inflation, and long-run economic growth. Each month, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, announces the value of unemployment rate for the previous month. The announcement is widely watched, and if the announced unemployment rate is different from what the financial markets expect, there can be large movements in those markets. It is thus important to know how the BLS computes the unemployment rate. The first part of this chapter describes how the unemployment rate is computed and discusses its various components. Here is the order of today's video clips. 1. Changes in the cost of living and consumer price index. 2. Case study, the index of leading economic index. 3. Calculating rate of inflation. 4. Comparing the CPI and GDP deflator. 5. Recession, depression, and bonds.
When you read the newspaper and listen to the radio, you'll hear a lot about inflation. The inflation rate is 2.5%, or inflation is rising, or bond traders are afraid of inflation. The government has a lot of different measures of inflation. Inflation means the general increase in the price level in the economy, the rate at which all prices are rising. But how does inflation affect me? Why should I care about it? When I went to the grocery store, I bought some bread, and my favorite loaf of bread now costs $1.25. Well, that's a big increase in price over last year. I know because I kept the tag. Last year, this bread only cost $1. This is a 25% increase in the price of my favorite sandwich bread in 1 year. This is a lot faster than the rate of inflation as I'm reading it in the newspaper right now. My question is, at what rate are the prices rising that I care about? I don't especially care about the price of aluminum or the price of electricity. I care about what's happening to the prices of the goods and services that I purchase on a regular basis. So, the government has constructed an index that focuses its attention on the prices that I care about, the prices that households pay for the goods and services that they most frequently buy. This is an index that answers the question, at what rate is the cost of living rising? And it's called the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is interesting to consumers because it's made up of the prices that are most important to us. That is, the stuff that we typically spend most of our money on. Let's look at how the Consumer Price Index is constructed. We begin with a basket of goods and services that represents what the typical household spends its money on each month. This basket has several things in it. The most important thing in this basket is housing. The typical household spends a fair bit of its income on housing, so we are looking at the prices of all things that go into making up housing. Your rent, your insurance, maintenance on your house, utilities, and stuff like that. So because this is such an important consumer expenditure, the Consumer Price Index weights housing very heavily. That is, about 40 1% of all the CPI is made up of housing price changes. That's the most important component. The second most important component is food and beverages. That is, what does the typical household spend to eat and drink each month? Food and beverages account for about 17% of the total of the CPI, and that shows its relative importance as the government perceives it in household spending. The third component is transportation. That is, fuel, insurance, and maintenance and depreciation on vehicles. So transportation costs, which add up also to about 17% of the total, because they're important to households, get a large weight in the consumer price index. Whenever transportation prices change, that feeds into the government's measure of the household's cost of living. The next component is medical care. And medical care accounts for about 7% of the total. This is the money that people are spending on doctors and medication and such like. So we'll mark 7% here to represent medical expenditures. Then we've got clothing. What are you paying to keep yourself warm and stylish? And clothing prices, also important in this index, get a weight of about 5 or 6%. And finally, entertainment. The government looks at how much you're spending on vacations, recreation, movies, and the like, and that adds up to about 4% of the total. That leaves a residual, what the government calls other goods and services, and other goods and services adds up to a total of about 7% to give us a nice round 100. So if you want to know what makes up the Consumer Price Index, here we've color-coded it for you. Housing, food and beverages, transportation, medical care, clothing, entertainment, and other. All the things that I care about, that is what I spend money on as a household each month. When the Consumer Price Index changes, you're spending more or less depending on the direction of the change. A rise in the Consumer Price Index means that the cost of the goods and services that you're typically buying is rising. That is, the cost of living is increasing. And the rate at which the cost of living increases tells the rate at which your salary has to increase if you're going to maintain your lifestyle. Now, how do we use the cost of living index? How do we use the CPI? Who is paying attention to it? Well, there are a couple of reasons why the CPI is important. The first is the CPI is actually figured into labor contracts. There are a lot of unions who negotiate their wages for 2 or 3 years out using the Consumer Price Index as a measure of the cost of living. These contracts have cost of living adjustments built into them. So the union, the employees, and the employers all agree that they'll use the government CPI as the official measure of the cost of living. And when it rises, wages, by contract, rise along with it. Also, the Consumer Price Index determines the rate at which Social Security payments increase. That is, the cost of living adjustments built into Social Security payments look at the CPI as the official measure of the increase in the cost of living. So the CPI is something that people watch and actually build into their contracts as a measure of the cost of living. When it goes up, a lot of people's wages and Social Security payments go up automatically with it. Another reason you should pay attention to the CPI is the increase in the CPI is often used to measure what we call the real interest rate. The real interest rate is the return on your savings measured in terms of purchasing power. That is, how much extra purchasing power will you have next year if you put a certain amount away in the bank this year? If you put $100 in the bank this year, next year you'll have $110 if the interest rate is 10%. But how much of that is actually spendable money, and how much of it is just holding you even for the effects of inflation? Say the inflation rate is 4%. That means your savings has to grow at a rate of 4% just to keep your purchasing power constant, just to account for the increase in the cost of living. If the nominal interest rate is 10% and the inflation rate is 4%, that means 6% is the real interest rate. Beyond inflation, you're getting a 6% rate of return on your money that's actually coming out in terms of real goods and services that you can buy that you couldn't afford last year. So take the nominal interest rate, subtract the rate of inflation, perhaps measured by the CPI, and what's left over is the real interest rate. The real interest rate is what households pay attention to when they decide whether they're going to save money or not. When the inflation rate is high and the nominal interest rate isn't high enough to compensate for it, I'm not going to save my money. Why let it sit and rot in the bank? Why let it sit and my purchasing power shrink? No, I'm going to spend money today. But when the real interest rate is high, I see that it's worth my while to delay consumption. And I put the money in the bank and I enjoy more purchasing power in the future. Now, there are all kinds of price indices. We focused in this discussion on the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index looks only at a subset of all the goods and services available in the economy, but it's the subset that a consumer cares most about: food, clothing, housing, entertainment, medical care. Another index that we can consider is the Producer Price Index. It's a broader index. It includes a lot of other stuff, and it includes the prices that are important to producers and their profits. It includes the price of aluminum, the price of electricity, the price of all kinds of raw materials, and other inputs that go into the production of the goods and services that consumers buy. The Producer Price Index includes a lot more stuff. And it should be important to you if you're trying to make predictions about what's going to happen to your own cost of living in the future. That is, if producer prices are rising today, it won't be long before producers, trying to protect their profits, have to pass those rising costs on to you in the form of higher consumer prices. That's why we call the Producer Price Index a leading economic indicator. It points toward what's going to happen to your own cost of living in the future. Each of these cost indices, whether it's the Consumer Price Index, whether it's the Producer Price Index, whether it's the GDP deflator, each of them is designed to answer a particular question. We've talked about the Consumer Price Index. It's trying to answer the question, what's happening to the cost of living as households perceive it? The Producer Price Index answers the question, what's happening to production costs, and what might happen to consumer prices down the road. Every index has its own question to answer. All told, they are indicators of inflation, the general rate at which prices are rising across the economy. You want to know where interest rates are headed. You're concerned about whether now is a good time to start a business. Perhaps you're wondering what the economy is going to be like when you graduate from college. Well, short of a crystal ball, your best source for information about where the economy is headed is published by the Conference Board. The Conference Board is a non-profit group of research and business enthusiasts who collect information and make it available to financial markets, people running businesses, the government, and others who are interested in knowing where the economy is headed. The most famous indicator published by the Conference Board is the Index of Leading Economic Indicators. This index is a single number that averages together information from all corners of the economy to point as to whether the economy is likely to continue to boom or perhaps to slip into a recession. It's a weighted average of information about expectations and behavior across the economy. And it functions sort of as an early warning. That is, when a storm is coming, often you'll notice that animals are anxious or nervous, and their behavior gives you a signal about what the weather is going to be like in a couple of hours. In the same way, the Index of Leading Economic Indicators tells you where the economy is likely to be headed 6 to 9 months from now. The difference between the weather and the economy is that the economy is actually made up by the decisions and choices of the people who are part of it. So to find out where the economy is headed, the Conference Board tries to figure out what people are thinking and doing right now that's likely to influence what the economy will be doing in terms of employment, output, interest rates, and prices 6 months from now. So let's look then at where in the economy we're most likely to get reliable data about what's coming up in the months ahead. That is, which kinds of behaviors and actions and expectations are most likely to have predictive power. The index of leading economic indicators averages together information from manufacturers, from employers, from financial markets, from consumers in the construction industry. And there are 10 components that are averaged together to wind up with the final number that's actually published. This number, by the way, is published every month. Here is a list, then, of the 10 factors that make up the index of leading economic indicators. The first is the average weekly hours worked in manufacturing. When that number is increasing, it could be because labor demand is especially strong, and factories are working their workers longer hours to meet increased demand. When that number is bigger, it's likely that the economy will continue to expand. The second thing is the average weekly initial claims for unemployment insurance. When that number is rising, it could be because people have lost their jobs, are having trouble finding another one, and that could be a signal that a recession is coming. The third component is manufacturers' new orders for consumer goods and materials. Whenever businesses feel like they can sell more goods and services, they're going to be ordering them to put them on the shelves or put them in inventory. Whenever those orders slow down, that could be a signal that a recession is coming. The fourth component is vendor performance. How long does it actually take for you to get delivery of these goods that you've ordered? Whenever it takes longer, that's usually because there's very strong demand and businesses are having trouble keeping things in stock. That's usually a good sign for continued growth of the economy. The fifth component is manufacturers' new orders for capital goods. Are factories installing new tools, new equipment? If they are, it's because they're planning to increase production, and that usually presages continued expansion of the economy. The sixth component is new building permits. Are companies building new office space, new factories? If they are, that's a sign that the expansion will continue. The seventh component is the stock prices. That is what's happening in financial markets right now. Is the prospect of companies strong in the minds of investors? If so, they're going to be bidding up stock prices. The eighth component is the money supply itself. Is the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply, making credit easier to get so that businesses can borrow and expand their operations? Or is the money supply getting tight, perhaps signaling that interest rates are going to go up and slowing down the expansion of business activity? The ninth component is the interest rate spread between long-term securities and short-term securities. When short-term securities have higher interest rates, it's usually because the Fed is tightening short-term credit, and that usually will lead to credit crunches and a slowdown in the economy down the road. The 10th component of the index is the index of consumer expectations. That is a survey among consumers about what they think the prospects are for jobs, higher wages, and a good standard of living a few months from now. When consumers are confident, it usually means that the economy is headed towards more output, more jobs, and growth. So what happens then when we take these numbers, average them together, and get that index? Well, the index typically will peak and turn downwards about 6 to 9 months before employment and output in the economy peak and turn downwards. That is, the index is a predictor of when the recession is coming. The last time that the index showed a protracted downturn was in 1990. By December of 1990, the index of leading economic indicators had shown 5 consecutive months of decline. And sure enough, the following year, a recession hit the economy hard. Now, the economy has been booming throughout the 1990s, but here, in February of the year 2000, the index of leading economic indicators has shown the first downturn in many, many months. So the question is, does this mean that we're about to head into a recession? Is the longest boom in U.S. economic history about to end, or is this just 1 month's aberration? You know the answer because you're in the future. But sitting here, we can only wonder as to whether these economic indicators are still going to have the predictive power they've always had, meaning that bad news may be ahead for our economy, or whether they're just off 1 month. No crystal ball is perfect, but the index of leading economic indicators has a venerable record and is relied upon by people in finance, government, and economic planning to give them insight into what's ahead. Now, here's a mystery. On page 1 of the Wall Street Journal, the inflation rate is reported at 2.5%. And on page 14 of the same day's journal, it says we've had 0% inflation for the last year. Now, how can both of these numbers be correct? Is there an error, or is there something I'm missing? Hold on. On page 1, it says that the 2.5% inflation rate is based on the GDP deflator, whereas on page 14, it says that the 0% inflation rate is based on the consumer price index. Now, I know that these two indexes are different, and maybe that accounts for the difference in their measures of inflation. After all, the Consumer Price Index measures only the prices of a subset of goods, goods that are purchased regularly by households, things like food and clothing, whereas the GDP deflator includes all of the goods and services produced in the economy. So, since the Consumer Price Index is based on the prices of fewer goods, maybe that's why the number is different than the inflation rate measured by the GDP deflator. However, it turns out that there's something else going on. What's going on is that even if the GDP deflator and the Consumer Price Index were based on exactly the same set of goods, you could get different numbers because of differences in the way in which the two indexes are calculated. I think I can make this point very clear with a simple example. Consider an economy that produces only two goods, food and clothing. We're choosing food and clothing because these are goods that consumers purchase. So the Consumer Price Index is based on the price of these goods. And since these are the only goods produced in the economy, the GDP deflator depends also only on the price of these two goods. Now let's look at the gross domestic product data for 2 consecutive years, the year 2000 and the year 2001. In the year 2000, 10 units of food are produced, and the price per unit is $10 for food. So $10 times 10 units is $100 worth of food production. Clothing, $20 per unit, times 10 units is $200 from clothing production. $200 plus $100 gives us a gross domestic product of $300 in the year 2000. Now, as we move to the year 2001, notice that two things have changed. First, the prices of goods have changed. Food is now selling for $20 a unit, and clothing for $35 a unit. The next thing that's changed is that quantities have changed. There's more food produced and more clothing produced. So the gross domestic product is going to be larger because prices are bigger and quantities are bigger. Let's go ahead and calculate the gross domestic product for the year 2001. $20 per unit of food times 15 units of food gives us a GDP from food of $300. Over here, under clothing, we've got $35 a unit times 15 units for $525 worth of clothing produced. 525 plus 300 gives us a gross domestic product for the year 2001 of $825. Now, I'm interested in what's happening to prices between the year 2000 and the year 2001. Now, since there are two different goods being produced, our overall measure of prices has got to be some kind of weighted average of the change in prices. And the way in which that weighted average is calculated is what distinguishes the Consumer Price Index from the GDP deflator. Let's look first at the method used in calculating the Consumer Price Index. The intuition behind the Consumer Price Index is, how much would you have to pay to get the same goods you got last year at this year's prices? So we're using the quantities from last year, but the prices from this year. Let's look then at how the Consumer Price Index is calculated. The question is, what would it cost you to buy last year's goods at this year's prices? So let's look first then at that amount of money that you'd have to spend. What I'm going to do is take the quantities from the year 2000 and move them forward to the year 2001 and calculate the spending I would have to do at 2001 prices in order to buy the year 2000 quantities. So in the year 2001, food is now $20 a unit. $20 a unit times the original 10 units of food that we were buying last year is $200 you're going to have to spend to get the same food that you were buying last year. What about clothing? Last year, you had 10 units of clothing. So this year, when you have to pay $35 a unit for clothing, you're going to have to spend $350 to get the same amount of clothing that you had last year. So $350 on clothing, $200 on food gives us a grand total of $550 that you have to spend in the year 2001 when prices are higher to get the same goods that you were buying back in the year 2000. Now, let's calculate the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a ratio. It's a ratio of the amount of money that you'd have to spend this year to get that basket relative to how much you have to spend in the base year, the year whose quantities you're considering. So let's calculate 550, the amount we have to spend in the year 2001, divided by 300, the amount we had to spend in our base year, the year 2000. Multiply that by 100, and you get the Consumer Price Index, which in this case is 183. So the Consumer Price Index for the year 2001 is 183. That's the amount that you would, the amount by which prices have increased from one year to the next. But we're interested in a percentage increase, the amount by which prices have increased in percentage terms, because that's the inflation rate. So what we do to calculate the inflation rate using this method is we take the Consumer Price Index for the year 2001, and we subtract from it the Consumer Price Index from the year 2000. Now, the year 2000 is our base year, remember, where it cost $300 to buy that basket of goods and services. So divide 300, which is the amount you have to spend in the year 2000, by 300, which is the amount you have to spend in the base year, and you get 100. The CPI for the base year, by definition, is always 100%. It's equal to itself. So subtract 100 from 183. So this is the CPI for the year 2001 minus the CPI for the year 2000, the base year, and divide by the base year amount, which is 100, and that's going to give us the rate of inflation. 183 minus 100 is 83, divided by 100 is equal to 83%. The rate of inflation measured according to the method of the CPI is 83%. The CPI has increased by 83% from the year 2000 to the year 2001. The price of that market basket of goods and services has gone up by 83%. That's the inflation rate measured with this method. Now, let's look at the other method for calculating the inflation rate. This one is based on the GDP deflator. Remember, the GDP deflator is the ratio between the nominal GDP in a particular year and the real GDP for that same year. The way you calculate the real GDP, you'll remember, is to find the value of the goods and services produced in a particular year using the market prices from the base year. So the nominal GDP for the year 2001 is 550, but the real GDP is calculated using the year 2000 prices. So let's go ahead and put the year 2000 prices into our equation and use the year 2001 quantities. So this means that the real GDP for the year 2001 is $10 times 15 units of food, or 150, plus $20 times 15 units of clothing, or 300. 300 plus 150 gives us a real gross domestic product of $450. Now, to find the GDP deflator, take the nominal GDP and divide by the real GDP, and this should give us then, after we multiply by 100, some notion of, on average, how much prices have risen between the year 2000 and the year 2001. And the answer is 122. So 122 is the GDP deflator for the year 2001. To calculate the inflation rate now, we have to see how the GDP deflator has changed between the 2 years. So we now want to do a percentage change calculation. So let's do that. 122 is the GDP deflator for the year 2001. What's the year 2000 GDP deflator? Well, it's the base year. So in the base year, the GDP deflator is always going to be 100% because you're comparing that year with itself. So subtract 100 from 122 and divide by 100, and that's going to give us an inflation rate of 22%. So using the GDP deflator method, we get an inflation rate of 22%. Now, why the difference? The difference is because the Consumer Price Index looks at the change in the cost of a particular bundle of goods and services. That is, it uses the current production at the new prices. The GDP deflator, on the other hand, uses the new production at the old prices. And because you're using a different method to calculate the two indexes, it shouldn't be surprising that we wind up with different numbers for the rate of inflation. Now, notice here we've done a very, very, very simple example with only two particular goods, both of them being consumer goods, and with some pretty extreme changes in prices and quantity. I mean, in the U.S. economy right now, our inflation rate is much, much lower than 22% or 83%. So this is an entirely hypothetical example. The point of this hypothetical example is to show you that you get a different inflation rate when you are holding prices constant and changing quantities than when you're holding quantities constant and changing prices. The method of the CPI gives you a different inflation rate than the method of the GDP deflator. Now, typically, these methods will yield numbers that are not so far apart. And if we look at some actual data from history, you can see that the GDP deflator method of calculating the inflation rate has given numbers that were pretty close to the CPI method for calculating the inflation rate. Some years, the CPI is going to give you a bigger inflation rate than the GDP deflator. And some years, the GDP deflator method is going to give you a higher rate of inflation. It all depends on how the base numbers, the quantities, are changing relative to the prices. Mathematically, we could go into when this number is going to be a bigger change and when this number is going to be a bigger change. But that's not as important as you're understanding the basic method of calculating the inflation rate using these two distinct methods. Both of them are trying to answer the same question. How fast are prices rising? But because they use different approaches to answering that question, they sometimes wind up with different numbers as their answer. If you want to measure inflation, which measure should you use? It depends on the question you want to answer. If you want to know what's happening to your own cost of living, the Consumer Price Index probably tells you what you want to know. If you want to know what's happening to inflation more broadly in the economy, however, you should probably pay more attention to the GDP deflator. The Consumer Price Index overstates the overall rate of inflation for several reasons. Let's consider for a moment some of the things that cause the Consumer Price Index not to be representative of the general rate of inflation in the economy. The first problem with the Consumer Price Index is that it's not a comprehensive measure of price changes. That is, it considers only the bundle of goods and services that households typically buy. The GDP deflator, on the other hand, is a broader measure that includes all kinds of goods and services produced in the economy, and is therefore probably a better measure when you really want to know about inflation. A second problem is the substitution bias of the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index assumes that people continue to buy the same basket of goods and services as prices change. For instance, suppose the price of red meat goes up. The cost of living, as reflected by the Consumer Price Index, will be rising because the Consumer Price Index assumes that people continue to buy the same basket. However, in reality, when the price of red meat goes up, people seek substitutes instead. And as they buy the substitute goods, the actual cost of living may remain changed relatively little. However, the Consumer Price Index doesn't take this substitution into account. It ignores it and imagines that people continue to buy the same goods and services. We call this problem the substitution bias. And because of the substitution bias, the Consumer Price Index overstates changes in the cost of living. The GDP deflator, on the other hand, is a broad measure that includes all goods and services and therefore allows some room for substitution. Remember, the quantities are changing as we move from one year to the next in calculating the GDP deflator, and that can reflect a change in the consumption of red meat relative to chicken. Another problem with the Consumer Price Index is people are always enjoying new goods and services. For example, I don't see any cellular telephones in here. I don't see any of the latest model computers. These are all things that make our life better. And yet, what is in here are goods that people were consuming 5 and 6 years ago. There's not a lot of scope here for the inclusion of new products. And not only are the new products making our life better, but these new products' price changes may be an important part of our economic life. I mean, you'll remember when computers first became available, they were pretty expensive, but their prices have fallen steadily over time. The same with cellular telephones and all of the other new gadgets that we enjoy. So, one problem with the Consumer Price Index is it neglects the effect of new products, the latest stuff that people are spending money on. Another problem is the Consumer Price Index doesn't take into account quality changes. For instance, although there is some air transportation in the consumer bundle, air transportation is much safer today than it was 30 years ago. So if you're paying the same price for an airline ticket today as you were in 1970, you're getting a much better deal today because the quality of that product has improved. The cellular telephones, the computers, the toys, the automobiles, everything is increasing in quality as technological progress becomes part of our goods and services. However, this technological progress and these changes in quality are not reflected in the CPI. That is, if we're paying the same price and getting higher quality, our standard of living is actually rising, although this measure of the cost of living would be staying constant. Also, we have to take into account that people's shopping patterns change. If we measure the cost of goods and services as purchased at a supermarket, for instance, then we're neglecting the reality that many people now are buying things online or in large superstores where the prices may be lower. That is, people change their purchasing patterns in response to new shopping opportunities created by the internet or by mega malls or things like that. As shopping opportunities change, then the cost of living as measured by this bundle, if we're pricing it at traditional stores, the cost of living would actually be overstated by the Consumer Price Index because people are finding less expensive alternatives in new shopping opportunities. So, the Consumer Price Index as measured by the price of this particular bundle of goods and services may overstate inflation. And some researchers say that the actual degree of overstatement may be as much as 1 percentage point to 1.5 percentage points. That is, if the measured inflation rate is 3%, it may be that the cost of living is actually only rising by about 1.5 or 2% a year. The Consumer Price Index tends to overstate because of the substitution bias, the neglect of new products, the neglect of quality improvements, and the neglect of changing shopping opportunities. For this reason, the Federal Reserve, which makes monetary policy for the United States, tends to focus more of its attention on changes in the GDP deflator rather than the changes in the Consumer Price Index. The changes in the GDP deflator are probably a more reliable measure of the overall inflation rate in the country. The CPI is still useful because it does tell you something about the cost of living. And especially if you understand its limitations, you can read the newspaper with an eye towards filtering and translating the numbers that are reported. In macroeconomics, the economy is an organism. Rather than the micro approach, where we analyze the cells, in macro we're looking at the whole animal. And if the economy is an organism, then these are its vital signs. Look here at a graph of the business cycle. On the horizontal axis, we measure the flow of time. On the vertical axis, we look at changes in real GDP around a trend. That is the rate of change of real GDP. And look what you see. Expansion and bust. Boom and recession. And here, like riding on a roller coaster, the economy expands and contracts going up and down over time. Well, immediately you've got lots of questions. Why do we have these sharp spikes of boom? And why do we have these very large declines? What causes the business cycle? And what causes it to be very severe in some periods of history and more muted in others? In order to discuss the business cycle in detail, we have to have common vocabulary, and that's where we'll begin. How do you describe a business cycle? Let's begin with a graph. On the horizontal axis, we'll put time, the flow of time. And on the vertical axis, we'll put real gross domestic product, the actual physical goods and services produced by the economy in a year. Now, one of the things that happens over time is that technological progress and the growth of the labor force and the capital stock make an economy more productive. That is, what an economy is capable of producing tends to increase over time through the natural processes of growth. So we can begin by putting a trend line in this picture. That is, over time, if left to itself, the economy would tend to expand. That is, its capacity for production would grow larger and larger. So here's a trend line. This is what would happen if the economy were just growing on its own smoothly. But the economy never grows smoothly. Things happen. An oil price shock feeds into the mix. Businesses facing higher fuel costs lay off workers and produce less. And those workers with less income to spend stop buying things so that other stores are unable to sell their products and other factories shut down. Then when people start saving money, businesses are able to buy capital at lower interest rates, businesses begin to expand again, and the economy starts to grow. Like any organism, there's this kind of fluctuation or breathing or pulsing. The economy does not grow in the nice, smooth expansion of the trend line. Rather, it fluctuates around the trend line, sometimes growing faster than the trend line in what we call a boom or an expansion. Then, after a peak is reached, some event causes the economy to turn downward, growing less rapidly, or actually contracting in a recession. And then a trough is reached, and the economy begins to expand again. Expansion, peak, recession, trough, expansion, and the business cycle unfolds, snaking around the trend line. Let's make sure that we're clear on the definitions of the terms that we'll use throughout our discussion of business cycles. An expansion is a period where gross domestic product is rising more rapidly than the trend. An expansion is usually a period where business is booming and where employment is increasing. Maybe the unemployment rate itself is shrinking, or the number of jobs being created is rising rapidly. An expansion is called a boom if it's especially strong, that is, if the slope of the curve is especially steep. An expansion or a boom ends at its peak. At this point, the economy is now turning downwards. What causes it to turn downwards? Sometimes the economy is simply overheated. It's grown so rapidly that the price of some raw materials is beginning to rise. There is inflation in producer prices. The Federal Reserve, trying to prevent general inflation, will then tighten the money supply, making credit harder to get and making businesses unable to keep up the pace of expansion. So we reach this peak at which the economy is now going to begin to deflate. When the economy begins to expand less rapidly, or actually to contract, we slip into a recession. A recession used to be defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. But now, in general, a recession just means a period of significantly slower growth. And especially if that period of slower growth lasts 6 months or more, everyone agrees that we are in a recession. A recession is a period where unemployment may be rising, or certainly the rate at which new jobs are created has slowed. Sometimes during the recession, prices will actually fall, but usually a recessionary period is one where inflation is much, much less of a problem. Price pressure is off because businesses are not expanding rapidly. The recession ends at its lowest point, which is a trough. A trough is a point where the curve has hit bottom, and now we're ready to begin another expansion. And the process just goes on and on. Expansion, peak, recession, trough, expansion, and so forth. Right now, as we are planning this particular lesson, the United States economy has entered its 108th month of continuous expansion, the longest in U.S. history. This is being driven by a lot of factors, particularly rapid technological change and general boom in the world economy. A depression, like the U.S. suffered in the 1930s, is a recession that is especially long and deep. There's no good scientific definition for what a depression is, but everybody seems to know when we're in one. And the 1930s was the last real depression that we've suffered. But a depression could come again anytime the economy contracted for a long period of time into an especially low trough. So, we have a cyclical nature of our economy. As the economy booms, we tend to see diminishing unemployment, rapid job creation, rising prices, rising interest rates, until finally we reach a peak. At this point, the economy slips into a contraction or recession. Price pressure is off. There are not as many jobs created, and unemployment begins to rise. Then we reach the trough, and the economy begins to expand again, sometimes with the help of government policy. So why should we care then about this business cycle? Well, in periods of recession, there are severe costs imposed on our economy. Recessions have social costs, like increases in alcoholism, increases in domestic violence and divorce. Many social problems are exacerbated when the economy is having trouble. However, there are some good things that actually come from a recession. During periods of recession, when people are laid off of work, it gives them an incentive and an opportunity to seek work elsewhere. Usually businesses lay off their least productive workers whose skills are least well suited to their particular industry in a period of downturn. This then frees those workers to look for more productive employment in other sectors. So there's an efficiency gain during recessions to having people reallocate into other jobs. Another thing that happens is a recession is good for your trade balance. People don't tend to import as many goods when the economy is slipping into recession because household incomes are lower and people are buying less of everything, including imported goods. It also tends to reduce the inflation rate whenever there is a recession. And those firms that are less efficient get pushed out of the market, and their capital can be re-employed in other industries. Let's look one more time at the historical diagram that we began with. In this historical diagram, we can see the business cycle over the last 140 years. We see periods like the Civil War, where the mobilization of the economy for wartime created a rapid rise in the real gross domestic product, around 6% annual growth rate. We see the recovery of 1895, which followed the panic of 1893. The panic itself created a recession, but then the economy boomed during 1985. World War I was an occasion for rapid economic growth as the economy mobilized for war. And the Great Depression, which followed the crash of the stock market and tight money in the United States, was a period of extraordinarily low GDP growth, in fact, large negative numbers. But the economy largely recovered during World War II, whenever all of our resources were brought to bear on the war effort. The Vietnam War was a period of boom when prices and employment rose rapidly in the United States. But ever since the Great Depression and World War II, government policy has tended to create a less severe business cycle than we experienced in the years before very active policy. That is, one of the things we're going to study in macroeconomics is how government policy can mute the business cycle, leading to lower highs and less severe lows. That is, fiscal policy, government spending, and monetary policy, the action of the Federal Reserve, can give us a business cycle that's a little bit less like a roller coaster and a little bit more like the ordinary country roads that we'd rather drive on. So, as we continue our study of macroeconomics, we'll be looking at recessions and booms, troughs and peaks, and the trend of the economy in response to technological progress and growth in more detail. We'll be looking at this historical picture. We'll be looking at the story of the U.S. economy under a microscope to try to understand what causes highs and lows, ups and downs. We are left with the task of explaining this animal. How does an economy manage to expand peak, contract trough, and do so over and over, snaking upwards over time? What causes the economy to cycle like it does? Why doesn't it grow smoothly and in an orderly fashion? Well, this is a matter of explaining the business cycle. why does a business cycle occur? And you know, there are almost as many different explanations for the business cycle as there are schools of thought about the economy. Let's look at some of the ways in which different economists have explained this process of boom and contraction. We can start with Karl Marx, who believed that a lot of what happened in the economy was about conflict between labor and capital, that is, the wealthy people who owned the machines and the factors of production, and the unempowered workers who were at their mercy. Marx believed that what happened was capitalists tended towards overproducing goods, creating gluts, then having to put the products on sale in order to get anyone to buy them, and that there were these lurches in the economy as we had periods of oversupply followed by periods of shortage. And that, of course, it was always the workers who ended up being taken advantage of because they suffered the brunt of these gluts through unemployment and other consequences. So in Marx's view of things, it was really about class conflict between capital and labor. And unfortunately, the fact that the economy is unplanned and is a wild organism instead of an orderly garden caused these cycles to be relatively severe. So Marx's prescription for the business cycle was more planning. Control this animal, restrain it, and make it follow an orderly path. A second explanation for the business cycle is due to Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter's view of the world focuses on technology. And Schumpeter believed that the economy was driven by a process of creative destruction. That is, people came along with a new way of doing things, better products, better production methods, and any time a new technology developed, it changed everything, and there was a period of disorder and chaos as the economy got used to the new methods of production. So, we're doing fine with horses and buggies. Along come automobiles, and with automobiles, new methods of mass production, which everyone then begins to imitate, no matter what kinds of goods they're producing. So the whole economy has to re-gear itself to mass production and factories, and with that there is dislocation. There are booms, the boom eventually hits some kind of peak, and then there's a period of recession. So in Schumpeter's view, the long story is driven by technology, and the short story is the lurches, the starts, the stops that result when people are trying to incorporate new technology into their own businesses, expand their operations with the new technology, or create new products whose opportunity is created by the new technology. So Schumpeter's view is that the business cycle is really driven by innovation. It is the byproduct of people's innovative, creatively destructive impulses. Another explanation is Keynes's. Keynes believed that the business cycle could be muted by government spending. That is, people tended to save too much whenever they got scared, and their fear led them to save and not spend, which caused the economy to slow down and tip into a depression or a recession. And the antidote, Keynes said, was for the government to spend on public goods like roads and bridges and schools, and if government spending increased, to countervail the decrease in consumer spending, the business cycle could be evened out. Keynes's ideas were very influential in this country until the 1970s, whenever we wound up with a situation in which we had unemployment and inflation occurring simultaneously. Keynes doesn't do a very good job of explaining so-called stagflation, because in Keynes's view of the world, there's almost a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. That is, whenever all the resources in the economy are employed, prices tend to rise through competition. But whenever there's unemployment, at least we have the advantage then of inflation being relatively less severe, because there's less demand for goods and services, and their prices are not pushed up so rapidly. But the important thing about Keynes's view of the world is that the economy is driven by demand. And if consumers don't demand enough stuff, then the government should step in and meet the gap. And if the government will do so, then the business cycle can be smoothed out. Another explanation is what we call the new classical version. The new classical economists believe that the business cycle really is no problem at all. It's just the natural interplay of supply and demand. Sometimes the economy is going to boom, sometimes the economy is going to bust, but well, that's just the way it is. That's the economy doing its own thing. And therefore, there's no need to mess with it. The prescription of the new classical economists is let the economic business cycle happen the way it wants to. That is, let's let the law of the jungle rule. That any effort to govern this mechanism usually creates more trouble than it solves. So the new classical version says, keep your hands off, let nature take its course, let the interplay of supply and demand determine interest rates and prices and employment. The economy is going to evolve on its own. And maybe the best thing for the government to do is to focus its effort on the market failures, that is, providing public goods, providing education, providing infrastructure, things that are going to make economic agents more productive. But don't get in and try to run the business of the economy, because no one is strong enough to rule the jungle. Another view of the business cycle is what we call so-called real business cycles. With real business cycles, the economy is being driven by certain real factors, like the price of oil, like technology, and as these things change, their effects feed through the economy like shock waves. So oil prices go up, that raises producer prices, which eventually raises consumer prices, which creates inflation, which causes the Fed to tighten the money supply, which leads to a recession. But it's real business cycles that say that the real effect is not due to any kind of mistake that people are making. It's just the natural course of things in the economy, that occasionally pebbles will drop into the water and shock waves will propagate across it. Real business cycles are driven by the fundamentals of the economy. And this is probably a helpful way for us to understand the economy as kind of a tightly strung instrument, and anything that touches it is going to create resonance throughout the economy. The final explanation that we'll consider is the monetarist explanation. And the monetarist explanation says that business cycles are caused, or at least worsened, by problems with the money supply. That the government makes credit easy to get, or the central bank lowers the interest rate by pumping a bunch of money into the banking system. Now we got a boom. Everybody wants to start a business. Everybody wants to start a stock portfolio. They bid up the price of assets. Then the Fed gets scared, tightens the money supply. Interest rates go up, people sell their stocks, and next thing you know, you've got prices falling again. That the booms and busts in the economy are due in large measure to poor management of monetary policy. And the view of strict monetarists is that if money is allowed to grow smoothly and not used as a very active policy instrument, that if money is allowed to be used smoothly or to grow only in line with increases in the demand in money, then the business cycle will be less severe. But any effort to use money to actively manage the economy ends up accumulating problems that result in more severe booms and busts. So which one of these explanations is right? Class conflict, technology drive, government spending, the law of the jungle, oil prices and other real shocks, or the management of the money supply? Well, of course, the truth is that every one of these elements probably plays some role in the booms and busts in our economy. The more common sense version, the conventional wisdom version of the business cycle that you read in the business press, has elements of all of these. And as you think about the most recent boom in the U.S., some of the things that are cited are technology has improved, which is changing what we produce and how we produce it. That labor unions have been held at bay by the fact that capital is in ascendancy right now because of the importance of information technology. We have this reduction in the national debt because we are running a relatively small deficit, or in recent years even a surplus in the government budget. And the fact that the economy is growing very, very rapidly. We've got a kind of freewheeling entrepreneurial culture right now that encourages business development and new job creation. The money supply has been growing pretty rapidly if you actually look at the numbers, but economic activity has been increasing. So perhaps the increased money supply is justified by the increase in money demand. And finally, oil prices and other commodity prices have been low until recently. And now the increase in those commodity prices is causing some analysts to be concerned that we may be headed for the peak. Who knows? Stay tuned and find out what happens to the most recent expansion in the U.S. economy. But in the meantime, understand that there are a lot of different explanations to account for the business cycle, and we'll hear elements of them in many of the studies that we do as we try to unpack the business cycle and make predictions about what happens next. In January of 2000, the Conference Board did a survey of households in the United States and found consumer confidence at record highs. In particular, if you ask people, are jobs easy to get? About 60% of the people surveyed gave a resounding yes. The labor market is tight, and workers, everywhere they go, are seeing these signs. If you want a job nowadays, it's pretty easy to get one. In fact, companies are so eager to get good help that they are bidding workers away from their rivals, and there's upward pressure on wages, which is leading the Federal Reserve to be concerned that inflation may be about to break out again. Now, I've heard of some cases in which companies pay their employees bonuses by bringing other people to work for them, and that new employees may actually get a car as part of the deal. Workers have it really good. And those of you who are going to be graduating from college in the spring of 2000 can look forward to a lot of opportunities. Now contrast the situation of college students in 2000 to the situation of college students in 1991. Students who graduated in May of 1991 may have had to wait several months to get a job. Jobs were hard to get, and instead of help wanted signs, we had students and other people walking around with job wanted signs. They were handing out their resume, knocking on doors, and looking for opportunities. The market was very, very slack. That is, people had trouble finding good jobs and jobs that paid wages that they were expecting. People had more trouble making ends meet, and there were other people who were simply unemployed and dropped out of the labor force because they were discouraged. Now, what numbers would we look at to gauge the status of the labor market? That is, what statistics tell us whether the labor market is tight or slack? The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes an unemployment rate every month. And what we're going to do now is look at how that unemployment rate is calculated so that next time you hear it mentioned on the radio or see it in the paper, you'll know the story behind it. The unemployment rate is based on a survey conducted each month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys about 60,000 households each month and asks two questions. How many people in your household are employed? And how many people have been looking for work in the last month? The population of the survey is all of the adult, non-institutionalized population of the U.S. That is, all of the people 16 years of age or older who are not in prison, in the military, or in some other institution. By the way, an institution of higher learning counts as an institution, so if you're a college student, you are, from the point of view of the BLS, institutionalized. Here's our population. The labor force is calculated as the sum of two smaller groups. First are all of the people who answer yes to the question, do you have a job? That is, the employed. And next, the people who are actively looking for work but haven't yet found a job, that is, the unemployed. If we add the total number of people that are employed to those who are looking for work but not yet employed, we get the labor force, and that number is 137,673,000. And these data are from 1998. Now, once you've got the labor force calculated, you are able then to calculate the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is going to be those people who are unemployed as a percentage of the total number of people who are in the labor force. That is, the unemployment rate doesn't include all the people who are potential workers, that is, this population up here, but only those who are actively choosing to work or are trying to get a job because they're looking for work. Let's do a calculation now to get this. The unemployment rate itself will be calculated as the number of people who are unemployed, 6,210,000, divided by the total labor force, which is 137,673,000. And if we take that fraction and multiply it by 100, we get the unemployment rate, which in this case will be equal to 4.5%. So the unemployment rate is the number of workers who are looking for work and not finding it as a fraction of the total labor force. The next thing we can calculate is the labor force participation rate. That is, how many people are in the labor force of the total potential population that could work. So to calculate that, take the number of people in the labor force, which is 137,673,000, divide that by the adult population that's not in institutions, multiply by 100, and you get a labor force participation rate of 66.5%, or about 2/3 of the people who could work are either working or are looking for work. So that's how to interpret these numbers. When you hear the labor force participation rate is rising, that's because people are being drawn into the labor market, perhaps by the prospect of higher wages. When you hear that the labor force participation rate is declining, it may be because people are discouraged and are dropping out and no longer looking for work. When you hear the unemployment rate is low, that tells you that of all the people who would like a job, only a very small fraction is unable to find one right now, probably because firms are so eagerly looking for help, and therefore getting a job is easier. Now, whenever we know these numbers, we can then think about them critically and ask, is this really telling us the whole story about the way the labor market works? There are three things to note about the Bureau of Labor Statistics measure of the unemployment rate. The first problem is that it treats part-time workers exactly the same as full-time workers. So there may be people who would like to work full-time but only have part-time jobs, what an economist would call an underemployed person. Underemployed people don't show up in these numbers because if you answer the question, have you had a job this month, the answer is yes. You don't have to have worked full-time to answer the question yes. Therefore, the numbers don't distinguish between full-time and part-time employment. The second qualification is that there are discouraged workers, workers who've dropped out of the labor force and therefore don't count in the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate could actually be falling with the labor force participation rate falling at the same time, and we have a problem in the economy. That is, people are not looking for work. They've stopped looking because they're discouraged, and therefore that fraction of the population that's in the labor market is shrinking. But if the people who are looking for work are finding jobs, the unemployment rate will not be rising. It could actually be falling, even though fewer people are working. So the discouraged worker effect is ignored by the unemployment rate. The third problem is that research has found that most spells of unemployment are short, that is, people moving between jobs. Someone who loses a job or leaves a job and finds another one relatively quickly. We would like to have some measures that distinguish between longer spells of unemployment, which point to more intractable problems. People who'd like to have a job but after several months have still been unable to find one, as compared to people who are only out of work for a couple of weeks. So the unemployment rate does not tell us the fraction of workers who are unemployed who have been so for several years, and therefore are part of a more serious problem than those people who are only between in a short stay between jobs. Now let's look then at how the numbers work one more time to remind ourselves about the calculation. Whenever the Bureau of Labor Statistics does its calculating, it looks first of all at the overall adult population in the United States, 16 years and older, not in an institution. And it divides all of those 207 million people into three categories: those who are presently employed, those who are looking for work but presently unemployed, and those who are not in the labor force. If you're not in the labor force, we take this red chunk out of our circle, and the blue and yellow that are left constitute the labor force. Some of its members are working, others are unemployed. If you divide the yellow area by the sum of the yellow and the blue area, you get the unemployment rate. It is the fraction of those unemployed divided by the fraction of those people who are in the labor force in total. So if you look at all of the adults in the United States, 63% are employed, 3% are unemployed, and 34% are not in the labor force. Divide 3 by the sum of 63 and 3, so 3 divided by 66 gives you 4.5%, the unemployment rate. We'll be thinking a lot about what unemployment means to our economy and how it's correlated with the business cycle. But now you know what the vocabulary is, so when we have these discussions, you'll know the pictures behind the words. When I was a kid, my grandmother would take me for a hot dog at Harry's Hot Dogs. The hot dogs cost 5 cents a piece, and I could usually eat 2. When we didn't eat hot dogs, we'd go across town to Joanne's Burgers. Joanne sold her burgers for 10 cents a piece. I could usually only eat one of those. Nowadays, I still eat burgers and I still eat hot dogs, and I still go to Harry's and Joanne's. Everything's the same. Same burger, same hot dog, but the prices have changed. Harry's hot dogs now sell for $2 a piece, and Joanne sells her burgers for $4 a piece. So what's going on? What's changed? The quality of the products is unchanged. Even more remarkably, it still costs the equivalent of 2 hot dogs to buy 1 hamburger. There's been no change in the relative prices of the 2 products. Prices have nonetheless increased substantially since I was a kid. What gives? The answer is, the change in prices is not about the value of the products, and certainly not about the relative value of hot dogs and hamburgers. It's about the relationship between products and money. When there is a general increase in the level of prices in an economy, we say that that economy is experiencing inflation. And inflation means that in general, it takes more of this to get one of these than before. That is, inflation is a general increase in all prices across the economy. Let's talk about inflation, what causes it, and why you should care about it. This first discussion is going to focus on definitions. First, inflation. Inflation is a general increase in the price level across an economy. Deflation, by contrast, is a general decrease in prices across an economy. Deflation is much rarer, but nonetheless happens from time to time. Hyperinflation is a very rapid increase in prices. In fact, so rapid as to be remarkable. People's response to hyperinflations is very dramatic. And finally, stagflation. Stagflation is a period in which prices are increasing at the same time as output, or real GDP, is actually stagnant or decreasing. Stagflation is also rare and requires some explanation. We'll get to those explanations after we've talked a little bit about the history of prices in the United States. And those explanations are going to take us deeper into the modeling of macroeconomics. What is the relationship between money, prices, and output in the economy? But first, let's talk about inflation. In the United States, over the last 25 years, the general rate of inflation has been about 6%. That's been the average. The United States is not unusual. Most of the industrialized countries of the world experience a low inflation rate most of the time. That is, prices are generally increasing. Some periods in the United States have been well outside of this average. For example, in 1980, the inflation rate was between 13 and 14% on an annual basis. That was, prices were rising relatively rapidly for U.S. experience. Recently in the United States, since the mid-1990s into the year 2000, the rate of inflation has been below 3%. These are very, very low inflation rates for the United States, and we haven't seen prices rising this slowly since the 1960s. In general, though, there is some rate of inflation in most countries most of the time. Deflation is much rarer. Deflation occurs typically during periods of economic stagnation or depression. In the 1890s, when the United States was in a deep recession, which was actually a depression, the price level fell during that decade by about 23%. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the GDP deflator fell by about 14% during the course of several years. In Japan, in recent years, that is in the early 1990s, there was a period of deflation that the Japanese called price destruction. That is, prices were falling, and because prices were falling, consumers began to change their behavior. When you see prices falling, you reason to yourself, well, this computer will cost less next week than it costs today, so I'll wait to buy it. And when everyone waits to buy, stores can't move their merchandise, and therefore they lower prices further. When prices begin to fall faster, people wait longer to buy things, looking for bargains. And therefore the economy can stagnate. With stores unable to sell products, factories stop producing them, then people are laid off of their work, they can't afford to buy products, and there's even less stuff bought and sold. Now, you might have experienced the same thing in the computer industry. That is, you see how rapidly computer prices are falling with the advance of technology, and you keep saying to yourself, why should I buy a computer this week? If I wait till next week or 6 months from now or next year, I'll get a better computer at a lower price. And therefore, you never get around to buying a computer at all. Well, that's the way things work in an economy that's characterized by deflation. Falling prices can cause great problems for an economy. Hyperinflation is a very weird animal, and when it occurs, it usually makes the headlines. The Wall Street Journal reported in Bolivia in 1985 that there was an inflation rate at about 38,000% over the course of 6 months. Look at this. In January of 1985, you paid $1 for a loaf of bread. Well, in June of that same year, you were paying $38,000 to buy the same loaf of bread. No change in the product. It wasn't suddenly super bread. It was the same product. And yet you're paying all this extra money because the prices are rising so rapidly. Why did that happen? Well, it happened to a large extent because the government was just printing a lot of money to pay its bills. And this economy was awash in trash cash, money that really had no value. It was just paper. And because the money was so plentiful and so cheap, merchants required bucket loads of it for you to buy anything. During a period of hyperinflation, you can sit down in a restaurant, order from a menu, and before the waiter brings your food, the price of your meal may have doubled or tripled. Now, what do people do when they're in a hyperinflationary economy like this? They become very suspicious of money. They are unwilling to accept money in exchange for goods and services, and frequently the economy will revert to barter. During some periods of hyperinflation, say in Germany after the World Wars, nobody would accept these wheelbarrows full of worthless German marks in exchange for anything. People instead bartered, trading the overalls they had produced at the factory and insisted on being paid by their boss for chickens that they went home then and slaughtered themselves. The economy moves away from the efficient kind of transaction that we get when everything can be paid for with cash towards the more primitive and costly form of exchanges that barter implies. So hyperinflation usually causes people to be afraid to accept money, afraid that it's losing its purchasing power too rapidly, and therefore they revert to barter, which implies all kinds of costs for the economy. Other instances of hyperinflation. In Serbia in 1993, the inflation rate was 10% a day, which over a period of time compounds into an astronomical rate of increase in prices. Also, in the Ukraine in 1993, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the inflation rate for the year was 4,735%. When prices are rising that rapidly, everyone becomes very, very concerned about money losing its value, and therefore people are afraid to accept it. Finally, stagflation. Stagflation is this weird combination of rising prices and declining output. In the United States, two remarkable examples of stagflation coincided with increases in the price of oil. In the early 1970s, in 1974, real gross domestic product growth actually was negative. That is, output fell by about 0.6%, at the same time that prices were rising at an annual rate of 11%. This was in large measure due to the oil price supply shock. Prices going up, and at the same time, because the cost of doing business was rising, companies produced less. In 1980, real gross domestic product growth was negative 0.3% in the same year that inflation was about 13.5%. Same story. An oil price shock affected the economy, reducing output at the same time that it increased prices. So this is what we mean when we talk about inflation, deflation, hyperinflation, and stagflation. We'll consider now how inflation actually affects your prospects in the market and your behavior.